Hi, and welcome to our live event with Ruby, our Ask Me Anything office hours. My name is Dan Marek. I'm the Director of Plant Based Culinary and Development here at Ruby. And once a week, we open up to questions from all of our students to ask anything culinary related that might be on their mind. So we basically do this in a question and answer format. All you have to do is type your question on the right hand side in the little box and hit the add button. It will be moderated before it actually comes to me, but then it'll show up on the right-hand side, and you can see the list of questions there. Each one of those questions has a little heart next to it. So if you'd like to hit the heart, it'll actually move it further up in the queue if you'd like it to. And I'll answer it quickly. So we're going to dive right in with our first question from Rose. So Rose is asking, how do you feel about baking with almond flour? I find conflicting substitution recommendations online. What are your thoughts? Well, there are a couple things to consider about when you're cooking with almond flour, specifically baking with almond flour. Almond flour does not have the same kind of glutinous, you know, you know, kind of textures that you're getting from a wheat flour, but it does work in a lot of other recipes. So if you're doing something like like a bread, it might be a little harder to use. But if you're doing something like sweets and different pastries like that, it actually is a great substitution to be able to use for something like that. Now, recommendations can vary on, it's not a one-to-one ratio typically on almond flour to like a wheat flour. Typically, it's like a half to three-quarters to one ratio instead. I'm not a huge baking expert, so Fran on our staff might be a better, person to ask on that when she has her next baking event or her next Ask Me Anything hours. Um, but from just from my knowledge, almond flour again is a great substitute for a lot of things. But I find that if I'm making something like a bread, like a sandwich bread or something like that, it's not always the best substitute for it, without adding a lot of other things to it. I'm sure you can definitely get there as an end, but I do find that it works great for doing different kinds of pastries and cookies and things like that as well too. But again, the substitution recommendations can vary pretty dramatically from a half a cup to one cup to three-quarters of a cup to one cup as well. So I hope that helps a little bit, Rose. If you're looking for more specific, things on a specific recipe, I definitely invite you to come to Fran's Ask Me Anything hours, who would definitely have a better answer for you on that. All right, our next one, Alice J. I like feta cheese. What is a good substitute, or is there a good recipe so I can make it? If so, where can I find the recipe? I'm sure there are lots of different recipes. You can probably just Google a feta cheese replacement. I typically use tofu as my cheese replacement, and I love to be able to put it on salads and things like that, or I'll put it in, like a falafel sandwich and things like that too. My recipe, I just kind of came up with off the top of my head. It's basically soaking the tofu, and I put it in little cubes first. And then I'll take a good amount of lemon juice, but also add water, a little bit of salt, nutritional yeast. Um, and I'll typically add a little bit of oregano just for flavor into it, just because typically what I'm using it for is kind of like a Greek style, so I'll add a little Greek oregano to it as well. I usually add dried to it as well. But I'll take that mixture and basically marinate the tofu overnight in that mixture, and it works out as a great substitute for feta cheese that you can crumble over salads or put it, like I said, into falafel sandwiches. And it's a wonderful way to be able to mimic the texture and flavor profile of feta. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of different recipes out there. That's just the one that I personally come up with to be able to mimic that. And I actually cube it, which you also don't have to do, because if you want to do a crumble, something that's a little more like a feta, that's totally okay too. You can crumble it and then marinate it at the same time. Hope that helps, Alice. Anna, I made purple sweet potato pie, and we love the taste of it, and it's beautiful looking. But I was wondering if I could use tapioca starch to give the filling more body. Yes, that you absolutely can. Tapioca starch will actually help to fill that out a little bit more and keep it a little more of a sliceable texture too. Sometimes sweet potato pies, purple or orange sweet potatoes, um, can be a little more liquidy than most people want to when they're setting. I always serve those pies cold to make sure that I have a nice sliceable texture. But by adding just a tablespoon of tapioca starch to the filling when cooking it will definitely help to set it a little bit more full to be able to give it more body. So you're on the right track there. That's totally something that I would add to a sweet potato pie to be able to let it set as well. All right, our next question is from Mara. I use plain table salt, and before I took this course, but now I'm loving sea salt, even though I salt very sparingly. Can you please tell me if there's any advantage in using a salt grinder? If there are any unique salts worth trying? Yeah, so I actually included a link here to be able to kind of dive a little bit farther into salts. Table salt is fine. It's kind of what most people use most of the time. I particularly like a diamond salt, and that's like something that I'll use as kind of like my salt, kind of carrier next to the stove. Um, and I too don't salt very much. I use salt very sparingly. So when I do it, with kind of purpose for it. I use it. I think the most that I use salt is probably in cooking pasta when I make pasta water. To be able to salt the water beforehand before making the pasta really helps bring out the flavor of pasta. It's pretty fantastic. But beside that, I'm pretty sparing on salt usage. Now, I will typically use that diamond salt for that as well. Now, there are some pretty big differences between the types of salts that are out there. Table salt is typically very granule. It's very, very tiny. And when you out of a salt shaker, you can just kind of see it kind of pours out of it. Like if you're using something like a sea salt, that's typically going to be a little bit more crystallized, a little bit bigger pieces on that, and you'll kind of get pops of flavor instead of having it kind of blend into it. It's one of the reasons I like diamond salt as well. It kind of helps blend into it a little bit more. Um, but sea salt is great. You can also get some of the thicker, like flaked salt as well, which is fantastic for like the tops of pastries or something you want just like a little pop of salt on the top of it for, but it might not be through the whole thing. You would use the granulated salts for that as well. Now, as far as unique salts, there are definitely a lot out there. Pink Himalayan has become, a very popular one as well. I actually do like using that as well. It kind of gets its hue from the iron that's actually in the ground as well. So you get a little bit more iron using that salt as well, but not enough to be able to be like an iron supplement unless you're using quite a bit of it. But that also typically comes in kind of a thicker crystal. So that and something like the sea salt actually are you can take great advantages by using a salt grinder because you can get it down to a smaller granule instead of the big ones that they typically come into. So using that grinder, you can usually put it on different settings on grinders from really coarse to really fine. And so I'll typically use the fine setting on those when using a grinder just to be able to get the advantage of what I'm looking for, adding it to a dish and being able to incorporate it really easily. Otherwise, using sea salt or Himalayan pink salt typically will come in a little bit bigger, granule. So I'll just add it to the tops of things like that if I'm looking for that kind of pop of flavor to this top. Some other, ones that are definitely worth trying. I would say probably the one that I use that's more unique is black salt, which an Indian salt and it has kind of a sulfur taste to it. I'll actually add that to my tofu scramble. Pretty often, I actually have a grinder of that I got from Amazon or somewhere like that. I'll add it to the top of a tofu scramble to add a little bit of that sulfur flavor to make it taste a little bit more like eggs for my tofu scrambles. Another one that I use quite often is smoked salt. So you can get these at specialty stores. I typically get like a hickory smoked salt or something like that. And I'll use that for making things taste like bacon, right? So either a tempeh bacon or a shiitake bacon, a bunch of different things you can make to taste like that. But the smoked salt is actually a great additive to it because it gives you the smokiness flavor, but also the saltiness that you would get from a bacon product. Now I'll usually use a bunch of other things in it as well, but that's one of my uses for smoked salt that I use pretty often to be able to make like BLTs or a carbonara or something like that as well too. So those are probably the salts that I would say kind of on the Like if you want to go into specialty salts, those are probably some of the ones that I'd look at. But on everyday use, I typically use a mixture between sea salt and a diamond salt. All right. Nancy, can you share some ideas on ingredients that taste or feel meaty? Yeah, so there are a lot of them out there. I use tofu quite a bit to be able to kind of get that, texture ish. If you freeze tofu, you'll actually be able to get like a chicken like texture out of it as well. Mushrooms are probably my go-to to be able to have the taste or feel of meat. Just yesterday, I made tacos by taking my taki mushrooms and then seasoning them with chili powder and a little bit of cumin, ground pepper, a little bit of salt and garlic powder, and then basically pressed it between two pans to be able to flatten it out so it becomes a little bit more dense in that as well. And then I use that for tacos, and it's a fantastic replacer for meat. Derek Sarno, who is Chad Sarno's brother, who helped develop our Plant Based Pro course, has a great YouTube channel that you can check out, and that's SARNO. He does a great. He shows that it's basically two skillets, and you push them down together to be able to flatten out mushrooms to get that. I'll actually do that with lion's mane mushroom a lot too. Just last week we had lion's mane steaks using one of his methods with beet juice and tamari and red wine. It was a really nice texture to it as well, and you get the sear on it from the pans as well. So that was a really nice kind of steak like thing too. Just this. For the 4th of July, we'll be joining our family, and they'll be doing like a barbecue, like a pulled pork kind of barbecue, and I'll be doing a jackfruit barbecue instead. So jackfruit is a great thing to be able to replace the texture of a pulled pork. I also might shred mushrooms if you take like trumpet mushrooms and shred them with a fork. It's a technique that I think I've shown on one of my live events before too. And then just saute it like with some onions and whatever else other seasonings you want. And I usually just put a barbecue sauce on it, just a store bought, or you can make one from scratch. But those are all great things. So mushrooms, tempeh is one that I've left out, as well, which is a great one. That's kind of a meaty texture. And tofu are probably my go-tos for those. Jackfruit I'll use for certain things to be able to, look like and have the texture of that pulled pork as well. But more often than jackfruit, I'm going to go with like a mushroom instead of that as well, just because they're easier to find and they're a little bit more affordable than the jackfruit as well. Finding jackfruit in the grocery store can be pretty difficult. I'm fortunate to be able to find fresh jackfruit here, but canned jackfruit is actually a great option as well. Just make sure if you're looking for that, you get the non-sweetened brine in the canned jackfruit as well to be able to get that texture and taste you're looking for. Hope that helps, Nancy. There's a lot of different things you can go down in that road, but again, I typically try to stay with the mushrooms and some of the tofus and stuff like that to be able to stay on target for my diet. Shar, wonderful to see you here. Hello, Dan. Are you a farro fan? If so, what's your favorite way to prepare it? I love farro, Shar, and thanks for asking. If you don't know Shar Nolan, she's also on a lot of these live events and is just a wealth of knowledge in plant-based and a great friend as well. Shar, so the way that I typically make farro, one of my favorite ways is definitely going to be in the fall. I make kind of a farro and mushroom soup is probably the best way that I like to make it. Like I know, I've made it and put it on salads and stuff like that as well, or just even as a side dish. But I typically love to pair farro with mushrooms, and I like the kind of wild mushroomy kind of flavor to be able to pair with it. So I'll do something like a shiitake and a button and maybe even a portobello, but getting kind of the wild mushroom flavor into that is fantastic. So what I'll typically do is just cook my farro just like you would any other time. Just boil it till it becomes, you know, just becomes like fork tender, and then I'll drain it out and put it on a sheet pan so it doesn't overcook because you don't want it to be too mushy. And then I'll use that as kind of my base to be able to add other things too. Cook it a little less if you want to, if you're making it into a soup, so it doesn't fall apart at the same time too. But then what I'll do is I'll make my mushroom mix with just kind of onions and garlic and the mushrooms and saute those all up to be able to get a nice caramelization on them all, and then mix them in with my farro as well. So if I'm going to make that into a soup, I'll add veg stock and thyme and other things to it as well. But I can just add that mushroom mixture to my farro, mix it up, and maybe even make like a little bit of a gravy for it as well for that farro to soak up as well. Thyme is a wonderful pairing with farro as well too. And I guess that's kind of, I've always thought of it as kind of the fallish season for farro. It's a great a great whole grain to be able to mix into that. And of course, it can be used at any time during the year. It's just I guess it's just one of those things I'm used to from my days back in Whole Foods, where I used to make those farro soups all the time. And it was a great compliment. So that's probably my kind of go-to use for farro. Thanks for asking. Is either the soup or kind of that mushroom blend into it as well. All right. On that same note, though, you can also do very light accents where you can just put in some lemon and some fresh herbs too, and it will go a completely different way instead of going with kind of the deep, warm kind of flavors into that to going much brighter flavors with farro too. Right, Lori. I think of antioxidants as losing their power as soon as they're exposed to air or oxygen. Should try to eat them as quickly as there are as they're ready to eat in hopes of getting the best nutrition. So that can be debatable a little bit, because it depends. You're not exposing the entire vegetable or grain or whatever to air right away. Some of those are still trapped in the inside of the vegetable, even if it's cut on the inside of those things. Now, there is a little bit more debate on if you lose the antioxidants when you cook something. And that is kind of plus and minuses as well too. I think that as long as you're eating that whole food plant-based lifestyle, you don't really have to worry about getting the antioxidants as much out of them because you're getting them. Often think of, like, it's one of the reasons I actually eat sprouts. Like, we'll eat sprouts a lot, and just like of all kinds of different greens, because I know that you're getting a lot of antioxidants out of those as well. But as long as you're adding things like that to your food pretty regularly, you're going to be able to get the antioxidants that you need out of those foods as well. Now, where you do lose them is the more processed the ingredient gets, right? So, a lot of times people add antioxidants and things to processed foods to be able to keep the flavor or texture to them. But if you're eating whole foods, you're getting a lot of antioxidants right from the food right away. So, eating them as quickly as possible. I mean, in that kind of 5-day window that you would keep food for anyways, I think is okay. But if you're eating it fresh and you're making it for that meal that night, I think you'll be just fine for that. All right. Svetlana, I just finished my stock-based soup assignment. I like your recipe for vegetable stock. I want to make more using my Instapot. Do I need to adjust the amount of water or cooking time? You don't need to adjust the amount of water, but you might want to adjust the cooking time a little bit because of the way Instapots work. It's going to cook quicker. Basically, it's kind of a pressure cooker, and it's making things cook a lot faster. So on an Instapot stock, I'd probably do about 30 minutes, maybe 40 at the most for it. So it's going to be a lot quicker than one you would just do on your stovetop. You can use the same ingredients for it. I'm a big fan of the scrap stock as well too. So, when I just made those mushrooms the other night, I took the stems off of them, the kind of usable parts that are just too woody to eat in a meal. Some people love those. I just trim them off so they're easier. And then I'll take the scraps, like the skins of carrots after I've been peeling them, and like the ends of celery, like just the start of them and the leaves and stuff like that. And onion skins. That's kind of like my go-to for those. I'll always put onion skins in those. And I'll take all that and put it in a freezer. So as I'm using that, I just have like a big baggie, a freezer bag. I'll put them into and then keep putting them into until that bag fills up. And once it does, I make a big pot of stock. So you could do the same thing with an Instapot as well. I'll typically put like a one or two, dried shiitake into just to add a little umami to the stock. And then put that in your Instapot, fill it with water, put it on for 30 minutes. You're going to end up with a fantastic stock. Once it gets to the 30 minutes, just let it, the pressure kind of come out as normal. And you'll just want to basically put all that through a strainer. And you have a great stock that you made for free with no sodium. So it's a wonderful way to make stock and have it around the house. I don't just use it for soups, I use it for cooking as well. So if I'm cooking other things, I'll typically deglaze the pan with a little bit of stock and add some flavor to it as well. If I'm making rices or different things like that, a lot of times I'll make it with stock as well. Sometimes I'll even, if I have a lot of stock, I'll even use it to cook pasta and sometimes to add different flavors to the pasta on those and sneak a little nutrition in for my kids sometimes too. All right, Catherine, do you have a recommendation on food processors? I have a Breville and don't really like it. It's very expensive and not a quality product. One of your practice videos showed a processor that had a built-in bowl scraper and looked very interesting. Yeah, so that one with the scrapers, that's a Hobart scraper. I know the one exactly what you're talking about. In fact, my buddy Chad had one, and I think Dawn used it in one of the videos that we had. Those are fantastic, but those are like, I think, $1,000 for a food processor. So they're very, very expensive. I don't own one myself. I think the one that I use personally is a Cuisinart, and it's I bought it because it's for home food processors. It's kind of the um, they've been in it a long time, so they've kind of got it down. Breville, I thought was a good product, but if you're saying it's not for you, that's understandable. Put it on Craigslist or something and buy a different one. There are a lot of food processors out there. Again, I like Cuisinart just because they've been doing it for a long time. The one I have has multiple bowls that sit inside of each other, which is great for me for demonstration process. So if I'm demoing out recipes, I can just take one bowl out and put a different blade in and continue on and without having to wash in between, which is great. Not everybody uses those. In fact, at home when we use those things, sometimes my wife will be like, "Why did you use the little bowl?" So now we have to clean the big bowl because there's stuff on the edge of it. But it's tomato, tomato, right? So but they also make ones that don't have all the bowls inside of each other, which are great. And they're the old school ones. In fact, my grandma still has the same one from when I was growing up. It's just a bowl with a kind of an on button, and then a kind of quick puree one. Those are the classics that most people like. At least I grew up watching. That's kind of what they were using. Nowadays, there are other makers like Ninja has one, and in that same kind of brands that have been doing those as well, and those are great. I think part of it is just kind of looking to get the process, like what your final process is that you want to do. Having the scraper on the outside is fantastic, but I've never seen that unless it was a professional series food processor, which again is great but very expensive, also hard to move and not the easiest to clean as well because I've worked with that exact food processor for many, many years. And it's not something you move very often because it's very, very heavy because the motor's so big in it. But the best thing by far is that scraper that goes around the inside. At home, I'm basically just using, a spatula to be able to scrape down the sides of my bowls instead. So I hope that helps, Catherine. All right, Christy, I'll be starting the Forks Over Knives class today and checking to see what tools I need besides knives, what pots and pans, etc. I'm starting from nothing or the basics. Thanks. So the basics is actually a great place to start for the Forks Over Knives class. You're not going to need a whole lot more, but there is an equipment list that's actually listed on the kind of in the beginning of the class. It's one of the sidebars you'll see. You can find an equipment list on those. Dee and our customer support was fantastic about putting all those into the courses for that as well. So you can find all the equipment that you might need. Now, that being said, just starting off with your basics, your knives, a good saute pan, a good stock pot. I think that those are probably going to be the best places to kind of start with. There are I can't think of a single one where you have to have like a food processor, but you might need want a blender or a food processor. And it doesn't have to be something like we were talking about here a second ago, like the Brevils and the Cuisinarts. Even the Hobart ones, those are very expensive. You can get a food processor at like any, like big box store for like $30, and above. But something just to basically start out with that. So I would basically start with what you have and see, if something comes up as far as specialty equipment, see what you can do to get around that. If it's something you're not going to use that often, because one of the things about the Forks Over Knives class is we want to be able to meet you where you are. We don't want to take it beyond what you have in your kitchen. You don't need a lot of fancy tools to cook. It's like Michael Jordan didn't jump as high as he did because he had Jordans on, right? He jumped as high as because of his own techniques that he had in himself. And I think that's the same way all of us are in the kitchen. The more you learn, the more knowledge base you have, the less fancy stuff you need. There are all kinds of kitchen gadgets out there to be able to make things simpler or to be able to do things in a different way. But all those kitchen gadgets can be done in a simpler technique than something that would plug in. Think of a mortar and pestle, right? Instead of a food processor to make pesto, same results. And some would argue that the mortar and pestle actually has a better flavor out of it as well. So just start slow with it. It sounds like if you're starting with the basics, that's totally fine. Make sure you have your knives, a good cutting board. Having a good saute pan and a good stock pot is more than enough to get you started on this and to continue your process as you go. If there is a recipe for something that comes up where you don't have the equipment, you can always email us at support to be able to find a workaround around that, or borrow it from somebody if you have somebody else that cooks too. But have fun on that journey. It's a fun class, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot. All right, Nancy, can you share any tips on browning without oil? Yeah, so I do this quite often as well too, and the it's you're basically talking about the Maillard reaction, right? So, we do that in the Forks Over Knives course. We show that off as well too, where you basically just want to get your pan to a heat point where if you drop water in it, it'll basically kind of float around like a mercury ball. And once you get that into it, you can add your product to it, and it will start to cook, and it'll eventually start to brown at the same time. Now, I typically, when I'm getting it to that brown point, I'll add a little bit of water to it to deglaze the pan. It could be vegetable stock as well too, to deglaze the pan and lift the product off the bottom of the pan easier. And then flip it over, and you'll see that you have that browning happening on one side of the product. Now, that is kind of different depending on what you're cooking with, right? So, onions are one thing, but mushrooms, another. Like a block of tofu, a completely different one with that as well too. So, I think that the biggest tip that I can give in general is to be able to watch your heat. Make the product thin enough so you can actually brown both sides pretty evenly, and you're not going to have like if it's a tofu block, you don't want to have the big white right in the center and both sides of the block of tofu browned. Um, so just consider that as well. Also think about outside the pan in particular, right? So like broiling is a great method, or just baking in particular is a great way to be able to get brown on the outside of your product as well, the vegetables. So there are a lot of different ways to be able to do it. So it's basically looking at your heat options, how to make sure that you can keep the product moist at the same time and get the most flavor out of those. So hope that helps. Uh, Nancy, do you have any thoughts on algae oil? Um, no, actually, I don't. That's the first time I've heard of algae oil outside of like a cosmetic place. But so I don't have a direct thought on that. I can definitely do a little bit more research on that to find more out about it. But everything that I've known about it has come from like cosmetics or lotions and stuff like that, but not with cooking. All right. Annie, is tofu safe to eat given all the genetic modification of soy? That's it's an interesting question because genetic modification of soy is something that's happens a lot, usually for consumption by animals, not as much as people. But if you're looking for an organic tofu, it'd probably be a better bet to be able to look for less genetic modification. You can also look to see there's sometimes a label on it saying not genetically modified as well. Tofu is a safe product. Millions of people eat it all the time. I eat it very regularly. I probably eat it 4 times a week, if I would say like that. My kids are kind of the same way. We eat it in all kinds of different forms, from just baking it, and doing like tofu sandwiches to tofu scrambles for breakfast tacos in the mornings. We'll use it for dressings, doing like a silken tofu and turn it into other things as well. But yeah, so tofu definitely is a safe product to eat. But if you're worried about genetic modification, look for organic and non genetically modified labels. So non GMO labels, it looks like a little check mark on something. You can find those on a lot of different products, including tofu. Hope that helps. Christy, do you have any suggestions for ingredients or foods to help someone with hot flashes? Not off the top of my head, but Christy, if you email me at dan@ruby.com, I'll do a little bit more research and talk to some friends that might be able to help with that as well too. Um, but I don't off the top of my head have an answer for that one, Christy. Rosie, the chart for creating dressings and marinades is great, but can you offer a ratio of the items, especially acids to fats? Thank you. So it's been a while since I've seen that chart, but there isn't an exact ratio all the times between the acid to the whole food fats. Typically, what I'm going to tell you right off the bat is to be able to taste them as you go. You typically want a little bit more fat than acid. The fat helps to trap the flavors and kind of spread them across your tongue, where the acid will kind of spike them up as well. So, what I would definitely, let's just say, like, I don't know, we'll say like an avocado ranch recipe, right? So, you're going to have like your different herbs, your chives, your dill, your things like that as well. You're going to have a lot of avocado in it. And then you're going to add just a little bit of an acid, either lemon juice or champagne vinegar, some sort of vinegar or apple cider vinegar to that, to kind of heighten up the flavors to it. But you're going to see that there's going to be a lot more fat than there would be an acid to it. So what I would do is start with your base fat and your other ingredients, blend those up, and then add the acid kind of slowly as you're going to it. But there is no golden rule of how much acid to a whole food fat there should be, really, in particular. I know that's a little vague, but I hope it helps a little bit for you. Um, Gulhermy, sorry, I totally butchered that name. Hello, I'm facing some real challenges in making plant-based dessert replacements. Do you have any suggestion for ingredients and methods to create rich and creamy vegan dulce de leche? Um, wow. I haven't made that in a while, but I have seen different versions of it. I think silken tofu is what I used the last time I did it, but I'm going to refer you definitely to Fran, who is our pastry expert, vegan pastry expert. She'll have another Ask Me Anything hours coming up pretty soon here. And I would definitely go to her to ask that question. I'm not as big on the dessert. I'm definitely more of a savory kind of a guy. But I do remember using silken tofu for the dulce de leche that I did do. But I'm not going to go too far into it because it's been so long. I don't remember what that is. So I'll definitely defer to Fran on that. All right, Victoria. Hello. Do you use a rice cooker? I've never used one before, but was thinking of getting one. Positives and negatives compared to using a pot. Can you use it for other grains as well? Thank you. Yes, Victoria. Actually, it's really funny. I have owned a rice cooker for probably 15 years. And I didn't use it for probably the past 7 years, but just moved it across the country with me, along with all my other cooking stuff, and just happened to use it last week to make sushi rice. And as I got it out, I was like, wow, I should probably use this more. But it's basically a great tool for if you don't want to worry about looking over your pot, right? So I traditionally will make rice in a pot, just an open pot, and then cover it. And but that's typically how I make my rice. Even sushi rice for years, that's the way I did it as well. But this week, having family in town and having my kids actually do the recipe with us and everything, and just trying to get all the rest of the ingredients prepped for our sushi, um, was like, let's just use the rice cooker. We've got it. We know exactly what texture we need to be able to make it happen. And I had sushi rice, so we used it again, and it's a nice, it's one of the nicer rice cookers. That's why I've kept it for so long. Um, and it worked out wonderfully. It like just came out the perfect texture for it and then I just seasoned it afterward, of course, for sushi rice. But I have friends that swear by them. In fact, I have a lot of friends that make their oatmeal in them as well. They'll actually do the oh, I can't think of the name right now. It's the heavier cut on the oatmeal. Um, but they'll also just do a plain oatmeal in it as well too. But yeah, so you can do other grains in it as well. But quite honestly, I use a pot, 99.8% of the time, instead of a rice cooker, for all of the different things that I would cook in the rice cooker. Why? I think it's just because it's easy. I don't have to like worry about where I'm going to store the thing as well. Like right now, I store it in the basement pantry because it's just one of those big, kind of awkward, machines I don't really use as much as some of the other things that I have stored in my kitchen. Um, so that might be why I don't use it as much. But for me, just a place on the stove totally works. If you're doing a big, event or like a Thanksgiving or something like that, and you don't have another burner available, it's a great, for something like that as well. But for the amount that I use mine, I probably wouldn't like if I didn't have one right now, I wouldn't go buy one. Um, so I think a pot works just as well. But again, having to keep an eye on it and just get the right technique just for you, because if you're making rice on a stove that's like electric versus gas, very kind of different things you have to worry about and look at. So, but yeah, but a pot kind of makes it for me each time, and it's just the classic, and it works well for me. All right. Annie, which is more nutritious, beneficial to eat? Collard greens, kale, chard, or spinach? Spinach is not my favorite, and chard seems quicker to make than tougher greens, so I typically go to chard. Out of all of those, you're pretty much all right in line there. As far as nutrient density, kale, I think definitely tops out the list, and then spinach, collard greens, and chard are right along there as well too. But if you don't like the taste of spinach, that's fine. If you're eating these other nutritious greens, that's fine. Just keep with what you like. You're getting a huge amount of nutrition just out of those greens. And if you're switching between them, that's great. It keeps some variety in there. But if you're not a fan of spinach, then by all means, don't eat it. Go towards the other greens that you like a lot more. Now you can replace those greens for the things that spinach might be into as well. Like I don't know, like a spinach artichoke dip or something like that. You can absolutely put something like a kale or a collard in those, depending on how you cook them, in the same technique that you would use in a spinach. So just think that when you see spinach in a recipe, if you're really not into it, you can swap out other ingredients to replace that instead of the spinach. And it won't have the spinach flavor, so it might surprise you and some of your guests at the same time. All right. Mitch, any tips on making tofu cubes crispy? Yes. I actually do tofu cubes all the time. I have some in my fridge right now that my kids are snacking on all the time. And basically, what I kind of start with is putting them into cubes, and I do a marinade on them. And then I'll do a couple of different things. I'll either do a coating on them, which is typically like an arrowroot or a cornstarch, and then a little bit of flour on the outside of those. And I'll put different seasonings in that mixture depending on what I'm using them for. And then I'll bake them off in the oven at 350 degrees for about 20 minutes. If you're not using oil, they will stick to the bottom of the pan. So what I use is I'll use a metal spatula, typically a metal one, to be able to scrape the bottom of the pan to make sure that whatever's sticking to the pan is coming up with the tofu as I kind of come off of that pan as well. If you're using an oil, just a spray oil, a very light touch on the bottom is great, and you can actually do it on the top to be able to make it so you don't have to flip it again. But if you're not using oil, you just need to make sure to take it out after about 20 minutes or so, scrape them off, flip them off to the other side to be able to get the crispy texture on each side. If you are using oil, just a little tiny bit of spray oil is all you really need to be able to get the crispy texture on the outside of those. Now, the flour cornstarch mixture is not needed, but it actually does dramatically increase the crispiness that you can get on the outside of those. But of course, you can just do it without the cornstarch and flour mixture on the outside too. Um, just watch the outside and you'll see the browning that's actually happening on them. But again, if you're not using oil, you will have to scrape the pan to make sure that you get the brown up with the tofu to be able to flip them and then cook them for just as long on the other side. Now, if you keep cooking them, they're going to get too crispy and they turn into what I call tofu jerky. So just keep an eye on them and keep an eye on the texture as you're going with those as well. Hope that helps, Mitch. Here's another one for Mitch. Thanks, Chef Dan. When I saute tofu cubes in a nonstick pan, it sticks badly, even with a little oil. I have also tried a well-seasoned iron skillet, which I would totally recommend with a little oil, and it sticks. More oil? No, actually, typically you wouldn't need. Um, that's interesting that it's sticking on you, especially if you're using oil in a nonstick and a well-seasoned iron skillet. That's just kind of baffling my mind a little bit there. The only thing I can think of is if you're using maybe a very like a silken tofu versus a harder tofu, that would tend to stick a little bit more on the pans. The other thing that you might want to consider too is bringing your pan up to temperature before putting the product into it, right? So um, make sure that your pan has got a little bit of sizzle to it before you're actually putting the product into it, because then as soon as it starts to hit the pan, it starts to kind of create that seal on the outside. Um, and it shouldn't stick, as you go. But that's probably what's happening. I'm kind of thinking is maybe the pan isn't up to temperature first before you're putting it in there, because I've never really had too much of a problem of it sticking, especially if you have oil in there, to be able to make it not stick. So try that. Bring it up to temperature before you put everything in there. Like if you put a drop of water in, you should see a little bit of sizzle on it. You don't want to put a ton of oil on it by any means. Just a little bit of oil is totally fine. All right. Yes, Theo, steel cut oatmeal. That's what I was talking about in the rice cooker. Thank you, Theo. Came to the rescue on that one. So steel cut oatmeal cooks wonderfully in a rice cooker. I have a lot of friends, and that's kind of the way they swear by doing it. Steel cut's definitely a healthy version of oatmeal, and it's that's what they cook in it as well. I'll typically do it on the stovetop, but again, you have to keep an eye on that one. So thanks for the win on that one, Theo. All right, Randy. My friend used a rice cooker to cook lentils. She said they came out great. Your thoughts on using for lentils? That's wonderful. Rice cookers can have a lot of different grains that you put into them, and they work great. I guess that when I'm doing lentils or I'm doing things like that, I'm usually using a stovetop most of the time. I also have an Instapot too, which is also in the basement next to the rice cooker, and I don't use it as much, but I would typically do my lentils and beans in a Instapot, but they will absolutely work in a rice cooker at the same time. Good point, Randy. Mitch, one more tofu question. Is there a noticeable difference between the uses for firm versus extra firm tofu? A little bit. Those are two that are very close, and we're basically talking about the coagulation that's happening in the soy on those, and the firm versus extra firm. There is going to be a slight difference between the two, and you'll see it. It's kind of like if you just took both of them and putting them on a cutting board, and you just kind of poke them on the side, you'll see. Kind of reminds me of like when they're poking Homer in from The Simpsons in the belly. How long does it actually move? Right? Kind of weird reference, but it's true. On the firm, it's definitely going to have a lot more moisture to it, so it's not going to hold up as well as the extra firm. The extra firm works wonderfully for doing things like you were talking about before, trying to get those cubes kind of a crispy outside. I typically go towards the extra firm as kind of my go-to, but firm will work in a pinch. You might want to just release a little bit of the water to it by pressing the tofu a little bit, or just by wrapping it in a towel, putting a heavy object on top of it so some of the water releases out into that as well. With the extra firm tofu, I don't have to worry about that as much. I can typically just pat it dry and use it right away. But for the firm, I might want to put it in a towel to release some of the moisture out of it. So, and that might help on your sticking question as well, the firm versus the extra firm too, just by patting it dry a little bit more. Hope that helps, Mitch. Good luck with your tofu. I can't wait to hear if it goes well. Rosie, Just a comment regarding cooking rice. I discovered by chance if I cover the rice with my steamer basket, it will never boils over. Or I tried covering the lid with a tight towel, and that worked too. Yep, that's true. Both of those things will work. I also know that if you put a wooden spoon over the top of your pot as well, it won't cook over, which is just the reaction happening between those two. But yeah, those two things will work. I'd be a little concerning about covering the tight towel over it as well, just because that towel can heat up very quickly, and sometimes you forget and you have a very very hot towel. But the steamer basket that does the same thing with the wooden spoon over the top wood as well. All right. Hermelia, is it important to use liquids that I cook the beans with? I'll be losing a lot of vitamins if I don't use it. No, actually, you can absolutely save the liquids that you cook the beans with. It's typically referred to as an aquafaba. It's a very popular thing to be able to cook with as well. A lot of people use it because the water that's in it has so much protein that's in it as well. It does have some of the nutrients, but you've actually cooked a lot of those nutrients into your beans as well too. So if you're not going to use it for a separate recipe, I wouldn't worry about it as much. If you are experimenting with different things that might use aquafaba, absolutely save it. Shar, who's just commented earlier, taught me a trick earlier about freezing it, which I thought was a great idea because a lot of times when you open a jar of, or a can of chickpeas or something like that, you're like, what do I do with this? Or if you've cooked a bunch of beans and you're like, what do I do with this? Freezing it's a great option if you can use it later to be able to use as a thickener or all kinds of different things you can do with aquafaba. So don't beat yourself up too much about throwing out the liquid the beans are cooked in. People have done it for a very long time and not even batted an eyelash at it. More recently, it's become more popular to be able to reuse it, which is great. But even on a whole food plant based diet, if we all saved all the water that our beans were cooked in, we'd have way, 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 way too much. So don't feel too guilty about throwing it out if you're not using it. Hope that helps. And that actually brings us to the end of our Ask Me Anything hours for Ruby. Thank you guys so much for joining us this week and happy cooking. We'll see you soon.